This video contains a presentation read in part by the speaker. Phoebe Nelms speaks with Yasmeen Long in a Zoom chat.
For our listening pleasure. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everyone to this episode of the NCPCR Learning Series. We're again very glad that you could join us today. Our presenter is Yasmeen Long. She's a director of Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute. Her expertise lies within health disparities, equity, health outcomes, policy, clinical research, patient, stakeholder, and community engagement, global health, and social determinants of health. Prior to joining Faster Cures, she served as the co-director of the Health Policy Fellowships and Leadership Programs at the National Academy of Medicine, formerly known as the Institute of Medicine. These fellowships were designed for early to mid-career national and international health science scholars. Yasmeen Long also served as a program officer at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, the PCORI, where she executed strategic objectives to advance patient and stakeholder engagement in patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research. At PCORI, she built key relationships with academic researchers, healthcare providers, patient advocates, and policy stakeholders. Prior to PCORI, she directed global health policy and tobacco control programs in the US, Asia, and the Middle East at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in collaboration with the Bloomberg Philanthropies and the World Health Organization. She serves on advisory committees and leadership councils focused on addressing disparities in healthcare and research, equity, and the health and well-being of women throughout the life course. So it is with great pleasure that we spotlight our presenter today, and we look forward to all the things that you will share with us.
Well, thank you, Phoebe, for that introduction. Much appreciated. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank Morehouse School of Medicine and the National Center for Primary Care for inviting me to this talk. And we'll go ahead and dive in. Am I looking good here, Phoebe? Slide-wise?
Absolutely, and it would have been great if I told everyone the title of our presentation today.
well, here it is.
Achieving diversity in clinical trials using a multi-stakeholder approach.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you all for joining. I'll go ahead and dive right in. So you can see me okay, right? All right. Here we go. All right. So for today, a couple of things I'll cover. One, I'll share what we do at Faster Cures and a little bit about the Milken Institute and our priorities within diversity in clinical trials and health equity. I'll talk about our work and some of our recent reports, what we've learned at the local level, sort of like a case study to share with you all. And then I'll go into talking about the role of patient and community engagement and achieving diversity in clinical trials with some actionable recommendations that we composed. A little bit about some of our impact through our policy engagement and a little bit about where we are in the news. So with that said, so at Faster Cures, I'll just go over a little bit of this, but Faster Cures is one of 10 centers of the Milken Institute. We focus on ensuring that treatments and therapeutics are developed faster for patients in terms of treating disease and improving health outcomes. And I lead our health equity and portfolio, which we do focus on achieving health equity across the biomedical research ecosystem using a multi-stakeholder approach. And this includes how we improve diversity in healthcare, as well as in the medical research workforce, the role of patient and community engagement, also the role of digital health technologies and the use of decentralized clinical trials or hybrid trials. In terms of using a multi-stakeholder approach, what we really mean by that is it's really going to take all of us stakeholders in the ecosystem to really achieve equity and solve this issue of a lack of diversity in clinical trials, which we've been which has been around for several decades, to put it lightly. And by multi-stakeholder approach, I'm referring to the role that all of us have. So that includes the role of federal agencies, regulatory agencies, the role of academic research institutions and medical research centers, the role of the biopharmaceutical research industry, nonprofit and private research funders, clinical trial research sites, and then, of course, patient advocates, disease foundations, and community health organizations. All of these stakeholders play a role in achieving health equity and diversity in clinical trials, and that's what we're focusing on and what I'll talk about a bit more today. So with that said, just a quick overview of our programs. We have our programs in three main buckets, which is capacity building, innovation, and global health. And then we work across these buckets with policy and our focus on health data and technology. So as you can see, our health equity and diversity in clinical trials bucket is within our innovation as an accelerating innovation, because we believe that achieving diversity in clinical trials is a part of the novel innovation system that is part of our research and medical backgrounds. So with that said, so I'll quickly just talk about some of the approaches that we focus on when it comes to thinking about patient centricity and inclusivity with our work in diversity in clinical trials. So specifically, I'm highlighting some key approaches, such as enhancing user friendliness and bridging the technical divide, extending reach, reliability, and reportability of clinical trials, process decision-making tools for participation, lowering the barriers to recruitment, enabling rural and underserved participation in clinical trials, and then also engaging in more diverse clinical trials workforce. So we really want to know, or we're really trying to determine, in terms of reaching underrepresented communities in clinical trials, and that includes not just race and ethnicity, but that includes rural populations, older adults, pregnant and lactating women, people with disabilities, people with low health literacy, children. All of these groups must be involved in the decision-making of defining research and the endpoints for that research in order to improve overall population health. So just showing you all the role that communities and patient organizations can have in increasing trial relevance and hopefully trust in medical research, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, we focus on the role of technology and making sure that there's technology-enabled methods to further engage participation in clinical trials and increase that diversity. And we believe that the enterprise we need a bit of disruption, and we should embrace the coming digital disruption and adapt technologies to improve clinical research and care, right? We believe that digital technologies can enable the conduct of research at scale and lead to more adequately powered trials. And then ensuring that digital health technologies are designed with ethnicity, race and ethnicity in mind, not as an afterthought. For example, I think many of you all in the audience probably are aware of the pulse oximeters that weren't reading people with dark skin. So to me, that is an indication that equity was not thought of in the beginning of the development of that technology, right? And so really pinpointing the parts of when we're developing new technologies and research to ensure that equity is included in that development. And so with that, some key approaches to that include enabling more efficient information sharing, data, the role of virtual visits, telemedicine and self-reporting, decision support tools, the role that technology has in establishing infrastructure and training opportunities, and then prioritizing trials with robust design for the highest public health needs. So again, the role of technology is really increasing across the healthcare continuum and including in research. And so we want to highlight the role that also has in achieving diversity in clinical trials. All right, next slide. Can you see that? No, my slides are not advancing. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So I want to share some recent learnings that we've learned at the local level and some of our recent reports. So the Milken Institute, we are nonpartisan nonprofit think tank, and we focus on a number of issues, and we also produce very high level, meaningful convenings, including our annual Milken Institute Global Conference, our Future of Health Summit, and then we also have our Middle Eastern Summit and our Asia Summit as some of our big marquee events. Last year, in the summer of 2022, we convened the first ever Health Equity Forum held in collaboration with the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And during that forum, it was a 2-day forum where we focused on national efforts that are needed to achieve health equity and diversity in clinical trials, as well as what needs to happen at the local level. So we talked about health as a civil right, as well as other issues such as having access to healthcare, right? I always say if you don't have a job, you might not have access to healthcare, and then therefore you might not have access to a clinical trial. Also, the role of housing, social determinants of health are also a key player here in terms of thinking of those determinants as a part of the barriers that prevent people from participating in clinical trials. So that was what we talked about. So we learned so much from that forum, which was great. And then from there, we put out a issue brief, the call to action for health equity, solutions from the front lines. The year prior to that, we put out a call to action for diversity in clinical trials, a policy issue brief highlighting some of the policies that are taking place. And I'll talk about that a bit later. And then most recently, we put out a report called Mapping the Journey, Building a Mutual Understanding for Health Equity in Clinical Research, where we really focus on, one, having a background of some of the historical implications that have not only created mistrust in healthcare, but have also created new policies that have protected human subjects in research, as well as the role of many other determinants around how do we ensure that equity is embedded during that clinical trial journey with sites that are where clinical trials are commonly conducted. And again, I'll go over a couple of things more with that.
The next slide is titled Snapshot from Faster Cure's Health Equity Forum in Memphis, a case study with key learnings. Bulleted text reads, marginalized communities need to be included in the conversation to address health equity, yet the burden cannot fall entirely on them to improve problems they did not create. The clinical care and research workforce does not reflect the diversity of the people it serves. Increasing size and diversity of classes is not sufficient. A pipeline approach is needed. Individual health information often exists separately within many institutions. Information quality directly reflects policies and practices under which it was collected. Incentives are not enough. Efforts to achieve health equity must embed accountability, including rigorous evaluation and standardization metrics.
And then just quickly, I want to just do another snapshot of what we learned from our time in Memphis, and I'll go through this quickly. But we learned that some of the key learnings are developing partnerships, workforce diversity, data sharing, and accountability. So by accountability, prioritizing accountability. What are the incentives? We need efforts to achieve health equity and embedding accountability, and also evaluating those methods and metrics to determine its impact. That was some of the key learnings from Memphis. So we learned quite a bit there, which was fantastic. So in 2021, we commissioned this report, Achieving Health Equity, an action plan to address diversity across clinical trials and biomedical research. And there we focused on a number of things. One, that multi-stakeholder approach that I mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that all of the stakeholders are players within this effort or this movement, I would say, and not working in silos. It's quite outdated at this point. We have the data, we have the expertise. I think it's time, well, it is time for more of a convergence of these issues to across enterprises and stakeholder groups. So one thing I want to highlight is that in the Food and Drug Administration Drug Trial Snapshot Summary Report, the 2015 to 2019 report, showed that 7% of clinical trial participants were Black or African American, 13% were Hispanic and Latino, 1% identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, in comparison to 76% of trial participants identifying as white. So even though that snapshot was the 2015 to 2019 snapshot in terms of these stats, the numbers really haven't changed very much. So we convened experts from academia, industry, policy groups, patient advocacy, and disease-specific patient organizations to dive deeper into these issues with the formation of an advisory working group. And this report is an outcome of those parallel efforts for better understanding the issues facing biomedical research and providing a concrete action plan with a clear vision.
The next slide presents a table of clinical trial representation for disease conditions, including cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, COVID-19, and cancers.
So this is a quick snapshot of today's clinical trials enterprise in terms of the numbers, right? So I'm going to highlight a couple of issues here, and then I'll go into dive deeper in a few more in a moment. But with stroke, for example, in 2015, roughly 27.1 stroke clinical trial respondents indicated working exclusively in minority communities. And then here are some stats with the COVID-19, where we saw COVID-19 vaccine development, where we did actually see some increase in trial participation. So for example, the Pfizer vaccine and their phase 2 and 3 trial had 9.8% Black and 26.2% Hispanic enrolled in the trial. Moderna phase 3 trial, 9.7% Black and 20% Hispanic. The Johnson & Johnson phase 3 trial, 17.2% Black and 45.1% Hispanic. And then the remdesivir phase 3, 20.1% Black and 24.8% Hispanic. So we have been seeing some increase in the numbers here, and the COVID-19 pandemic really helped to accelerate the focus on this issue a bit more. So with that said, lastly, cancers. I'll just highlight in 230 trials leading to FDA oncology drug approvals over the past decade, race was reported in only 63% of those trials. And we know cancers affect across all areas, whether it's race, ethnicity, geographic, cancer is cancer. So obviously, this is a place where an increase in diversity in clinical trials for drug and product development and therapeutics, when one might not be available for a life-saving treatment, is incredibly important in cancer research. So I just want to also highlight quickly cardiovascular disease and diabetes. About 3% of physicians and patients participate in clinical trial research that leads to new therapies. And between 2006 and 2020, 2006 to 2020, the FDA approved 24 new drugs for 7 cardiovascular conditions. And in related clinical trials supporting approval, 2.9% of participants were Black, and 47% of Black adults have been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, compared with 36% of white adults. So as you can see, within the development of cardiovascular disease or medications or therapeutics, the enrollment for Black participants is incredibly low. However, the incidence of Blacks being diagnosed with cardiovascular disease is quite high. And then in diabetes, in 5 of the 7 diabetes drug trials conducted before 2017, Black participants were less than 5% of the patients were enrolled in those studies, and 12.1% of the Black population in the US has diabetes, compared with 7.4% of the white population. So I'm just highlighting what some of these stats are, particularly in these 2 key areas where cardiovascular disease and diabetes significantly impact Blacks and African Americans. All right, so with that, I'm going to talk a bit about patient and community engagement and diversity in clinical trials and the role that we have played in our recommendations for that. I do want to take you through an infographic that was a part of our Mapping the Journey clinical trial report, where we provide an example of a study patient's clinical trial journey, and then identifying the specific insight that health equity can be embedded. So I hope you all can see this.
Yes.
Well, you can? Okay, good, because I have to read from here. It's got my glasses on, and glasses are here. Thank God. So with that, just thinking, for example, when you think about the people who are involved in study planning and community outreach, let's say at the study participant, when the study participant arrives at that clinical trial site, and a recommendation for health equity at this point would be to address the need patients and communities from assessing trials by developing relationships with community leaders and health centers, and sponsors and principal investigators should identify the barriers to access and support closing those gaps to participation, whether that is developing trust in the community, whether that involves building relationships with certain communities or patient groups or patient organizations, and not coming in and collecting your data and then leaving and not just establishing a relationship with that community. And also the dissemination of study results and the role that that has in the impact of health outcomes, and ensuring that information is returned back to the community. So really working in partnership with communities in terms of thinking of how we enroll more diverse participation in clinical trials. And then I'll also talk about here, when we think about the people involved in research, that includes program coordinators, obviously the principal investigator, also those phlebotomists, those are collecting human specimens. All of those are people who are involved in the patient's journey during the enrollment of the clinical trial. And when we think about the people who are involved in that research that I just mentioned, pinpoints for recommendations for health equity would be implementing policy guidance for inclusive clinical research, such as the recent FDA guidance for diversity action plans, and then also translating recruitment materials to language colloquially spoken in diverse communities, and then ensuring that research plans, recruitment materials, and research protocols are co-designed with patient advocates and community members to achieve health equity and research programs. So really meeting patients and communities where they're at. There could be issues with transportation. It could be issues with my medication's I'm not feeling well. It could be issues with I can't take off of work. All of those things are barriers that can be solved in order to increase participation in clinical trials. And then thinking about the role of data collection, when we think about collecting study participant and patient data, really thinking about how to incorporate the correct metrics and determining milestone checks to confirm that the clinical research program achieved their diversity goals, and then maintaining that ongoing communication and sharing the results with the participants that participate in that study, and translating that, and not just in colloquially spoken languages, but also in layperson's terms. Not everyone understands academic writing or peer-reviewed journals. And so really when those results come out of that particular study that a participant might have been in, or a population of participants were in, ensuring that they get to know what the results of that study were, so that they can apply that to improve their health outcomes. So that's an infographic that's included in our in our Mapping the Journey report. So I'll move on from here, but as you can see, those are a couple of recommendations for achieving health equity and some of those pinpoints. All right, so I want to highlight a couple of actionable steps for patient communities for achieving diversity in clinical trials. So in other words, what role do patients, advocates, what role do patient organizations, community health organizations, what is their role in terms of achieving this? And I'm focusing specifically on patient communities, because I'm aware that the National Center for Primary Care focuses quite a bit on patient and community engagement. So I've called those out specifically for this presentation. But patient and community organizations can provide expertise on lived experience with a disease condition to help make funding decisions, or lend their expertise to inform health policy decisions, otherwise valuing lived experience as a form of expertise. So we value higher education, of course, we value doctorates, we value medical degrees, but those who actually are living with a particular condition are experts in their condition, and that should be valued just as much as we value terminal degrees in this area as expertise. And then the role of engagement, developing opportunities for community health workers, for example, to support building meaningful relationships with community health providers, and members across community health centers, for example, and clinical trial sites. And then the role of the workforce, utilizing the community health research workforce to support capacity building for clinical research competency. So basically, people that look like those in the community and helping them to navigate, better understand research, and really being a support mechanism in terms of having them better understand what research is, why, and the role that it has in improving population health. And then again, accountability, working in collaboration with clinical research site teams or researchers to implement procedures to include patient advocates and community engagement methods that will inform drug and product development processes. And I want to highlight a couple more on those three buckets. So another thing that we recommend for our actionable steps for communities in terms of having a role to play in increasing diversity in clinical trials includes building relationships to support expanding the infrastructure to make clinical trials more accessible to underrepresented patient communities at primary care and community health facilities, community healthcare facilities. So if you think of rural communities where, participating in a clinical trial, could be a 5-hour drive, for example, to an academic medical center where a trial might be hosted. So how do we engage better with communities that may not have that that may have those geographic barriers, whether that's with technology, whether that's with the role of decentralized clinical trials, but also ensuring that there's infrastructure for that. So a rural community, ensuring that there's broadband access, that there's access to internet. Those are important components particularly for those geographic communities that are underrepresented. And then leveraging the support of community-based organizations, leaders, and local businesses to build patient and community advisory coalitions and really building trust, right? So when we think about diversity in clinical trials, it's not necessarily always about whether a person wants to participate. Sometimes there could be a lack of trust just from a regular doctor's visit. You walk into a doctor's office, they might not speak to you or say hello, or you're talked down on, or something like that. So there are other issues that also, in addition to the historical horrors that have taken place when we think about Henrietta Lacks and the United States Public Health Service study was at Tuskegee. When we think about those types of horrors, and there's many examples of that that are part of the distrust, but also the direct patient and patient to physician engagement that takes place in a regular doctor's visit or healthcare appointment, for example. And then prioritizing the use of programs and developing inclusive clinical trial training and patient navigation programs. So really supporting and investing in the workforce and allowing that workforce to serve the community and also help them to navigate some of these programs for better participation. And then for accountability, we think about, I mentioned patient or community advisory councils, really leveraging the expertise or forming these types of councils that can really help to co-develop endpoints for the research, or co-develop research plans, or determine what language would be best to use for a better comprehension of research, and really, again, leveraging the expertise of those patient and community advisors as part of the research team, so to speak. And then thinking about how do we eliminate the barriers to allow patients and communities to access clinical trials according to their needs. Like, what's most important to them? What does the community need? Ask them, right? I think that's where we think if you really think about trying to understand barriers or levels of mistrust with the community, going and asking them, maybe that's a focus group, maybe that's working with the patient advisory group, and finding out what's most important to them when it comes to research. And then collaborating with clinical research site teams and implementing procedures to include advocates and methods for informing drug and product development processes to increase trust in medical research.
Yes.
So those are some action steps that we have recommended. Those are some action steps that we have recommended for patient and patient communities to increase diversity in clinical trials. All right. Hope I'm not going too fast, but I think I'm on time. I'm sure I'll get a note from the team if I'm not. But I do want to highlight some of our policy engagements for diversity in clinical trials. The needle is actually moving in this area. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really exacerbated not only sort of the social justice movement, but the focus on health equity in a number of areas. And so we want to make sure that we are the great Frida Lewis Hall has said that, is this a moment or a movement? And we are advocating for this being a movement to really have meaningful change for the long term, really sustaining these efforts and not allowing it to be the thing to do or the buzzword or what have you, because those who experience inequities are living with it, and it's not the cool thing to do for them. So I just want to sort of put that out there. But in thinking of clinical trial legislation, one of our reports helped to inspire, for lack of a better word, policymakers to really focus on how do we mandate more diversity in clinical trials through policy. So in February 2022, Congresswoman Anna Chu, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, and Congresswoman Robin Kelly composed the DEPICT Act, which is the Diverse and Equitable Participation in Clinical Trials Act, which was aimed at boosting diversity in clinical trials by requiring enhanced data reporting on clinical trial demographics and providing resources such as workshops and community health center grants to improve access to clinical trials. And we contributed to this legislation. And there's more focus on it, but I'm highlighting just that bullet point on the data reporting and grants. Another one that was on the horizon is the Diversifying Investigations via Equitable Research Studies for Everyone Trials Act. We did not contribute to this legislation, but it's just an example of what's happening on the policy front. This was introduced in August of 2021 by Senators Bob Menendez, Tim Scott, and Senate and Congressman Paul Ruiz and Larry Bouchon in the House of Representatives. And this would allow DHHS to ensure grants or enter into contractual agreements to support education, outreach, and recruitment for clinical trials for diseases with the disproportionate impact on other underrepresented populations. And then I'm just highlighting here the 21st Century Cures 2.0 Act, which is a 2.0 from the original 24th Century Cures Act. This was introduced by Congresswoman Diane DeGette and former Congressman Fred Upton, which included the creation of ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health, and then also ensuring that we require more diversity in trials to ensure any new drugs and treatments approved for use in the U.S. are both safe and effective for greater and more representative more representative of the population. So in other words, that's the point of clinical trials, is to ensure that the drug or therapeutic that is being developed is safe and efficacious for those taking it. So that's why we need more diversity in these trials, particularly for the medications that will improve health outcomes, medications or treatments. Another policy highlight I want to share is that with that, our contributions to the DEPICT Act and the NIH Clinical Trials Diversity Act, this was rolled into the federal omnibus spending package, and we contributed a couple of points to the omnibus that includes appropriate representativeness of diverse patient groups in clinical trials by identifying and promoting actionable strategies for increasing diversity in the planning, design, and recruitment, enrollment, and execution of the FDA's review of clinical trials, and addressing diversity and inclusion in the health research workforce, which we believe are key priorities for legislation. And then this recent legislation proposed by Congress encouraged concerted action to promote clinical trial diversity by requiring product manufacturers and clinical trial sponsors to submit diversity action plans to the FDA that will include enrollment and diversity goals for clinical trials. And that would be a requirement for research sponsors to submit that to the FDA, and then that annual report would go to Congress. And then lastly, guidance would also consider the use of resources such as digital health tools, including telemedicine, decentralized or hybrid trials to increase diversity in clinical trials. And the FDA recently put out guidance on the decentralized clinical trials specifically. So as you can see, there's been some great policy advancement here on this issue. So the needle is moving forward. So we're keeping the momentum up there. Lastly, I will share some of our quotes in the news. These are just some hyperlinks. You'll receive those shortly. I know that the team will share these links, but we're quoted quite a bit in the news, particularly in Bloomberg Law, Modern Healthcare. We've been quoted in National Journal and a number of other news outlets. Really focus on some of these key issues with regards to the role of clinical trial diversity and all of the laws that are being developed, mandated, or reaching about to reach the House floor, so to speak, and really thinking about what role do certain organizations have. For example, here's an article here about the role of review boards and so on and so forth. So we're quoted quite a bit in the news on this area, and so we'll share those links a bit later.
Articles linked include May 2023, CVS Health to shut down clinical trials division. May 2023, FDA issues draft guidance on decentralized clinical trials. January 2023, diversity mandate for clinical trials aids review board's role. January 2023, diversity in clinical trials at FDA gets a boost from new law. December 2022, FDA's CALIF calls for greater focus on clinical trial diversity.
So that concludes the PowerPoint presentation. So I thank you all for participating and listening, and we can go into Q&A.
Phoebe Nelms and Yasmeen Long speak together on Zoom.
Thank you so very much. I learned so much and appreciated the enthusiasm and the passion with which you presented the volume of work that you've done. It seems that a few themes really stood out, really it's about relationships and trust. And the whole point of diversity in clinical trials is to ensure safety and efficacy, not only of medications, but also of other treatment protocols. So thank you so much. At this time, we would love to know if anyone in our audience has questions or observations that they would like to share with us at this time. We'd be more than happy to entertain those. So we'll give you just a few minutes to gather your thoughts. I believe that you will be able to raise your hand or unmute to ask a question or to share an observation as to the value of this information to you and your work. One question that we have for consideration is what barriers are you finding that the communities you work with are experiencing? You mentioned quite a few, which seem to stand out the most as barriers to diversity in clinical trials.
So, one of the things I highlighted on in terms of those barriers to communities are a lot of them are social determinants, right? So again, it could be transportation issues, that could be mobility issues, right? And for example, physical mobility issues. It could be, again, perhaps working in a type of job where you don't get paid time off, or you don't have that luxury, or you need someone to watch your children or your grandchildren, or all of those are barriers that impede participation in clinical trials. But I also think that mistrust and distrust is also at the heart of the issue. As I mentioned, some of the horrors that have taken place in earlier research, as I mentioned earlier, we highlight that in that Mapping the Journey report, where I went over that infographic. And there are a number of nuances that can create that mistrust, such as not listening to you. Go to your doctor's office, but your doctor's not listening to you, or they're not valuing your opinion, or they're denying your pain, or there's so many elements within the healthcare system that can exacerbate that sort of lack of trust in the system, and also bigger issues such as misdiagnosis. So the goal would be to really establish the trust. There's a term called bleed and flee that they used to say in terms of conducting research, where the researchers would come in, collect your data, your specimens, your blood, and then they're gone to write their paper, and then they're never seen again by the community. That is not a meaningful connection. And if we're developing research to improve health outcomes, then it's those communities that would really benefit from the impact of that, the outcomes of that research. I'll talk about a quick example. And one of my positions earlier in my career, I worked as a program coordinator for clinical research. And it was a study focused on kidney disease. And so I was collecting back when we used paper surveys. So I was collecting the data and going over the consent form with the study participant and everything. And the study participant said, well, once the study's over, will I see the results? Will I have access to the results of the study? Now, I didn't say it out loud, but in my head, I thought, well, no, you're not, because you're going to have to, one, access a peer-reviewed journal that could be behind a paywall. Then you have to understand the language and that sort of, the academic research language that how peer-reviewed journals are normally composed. And then how would you apply that information? How would you apply that data? And that's where there needs to be more co-collaboration with communities and community leaders to really establish those partnerships so that that research really does have an impact and is disseminated in the community as a return on investment for them as well, right? So that was a long-winded answer, but I hope I answered it.
Well, I appreciate how you started the answer, because I don't think I will ever forget that little saying, they bled and fled. I don't think that's pretty much cemented it in my mind. There's an interesting observation and question in our chat. Given how many research assistants make up research teams and interpersonal relationships with participants, I'm curious if you have any ideas as to what we can do to really push these important issues.
And important issues as such as what I'm speaking about specifically in terms of achieving diversity in clinical trials, or are we talking more workforce? I see the question. I might need some more clarification to answer it.
Yes, let's hope that they will add a little clarification to the question.
And one thing I can say, if there's any ideas on how we can really push these important issues, it's really, it's again, I can't stress the, building the trust. And yes, I see in the second question, trust does take time. So if you're, for example, if you're developing your research plan, and then you want to, your research is approved, and then you want to start collecting your data from certain groups or community members, let's say a month later, well, that's not enough time to build that relationship. So we really have to think about this from the beginning, when you're trying to answer the research question, when you're developing the SOPs, when you're developing that research plan. That is the time to think about incorporating equity into that research, and not after the data is collected, when you realize you didn't enroll enough African Americans or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans, not as an afterthought, as the beginning of part of that design, so that it's embedded in the research from beginning to end. So I hope I answered that question. I took a stab at it, but if there's more, I'm happy to.
Well, I believe she's quite satisfied with the answer, because she said yes, exactly, about developing trust. I think you answered it with the bled and fled illustration.
All right, there we go. Thank you.
We have to come up with another cute, catchy phrase that is the opposite of bled and fled.
I know that needs to do better. I also want to mention, with the building the trust, we have to get, and I mean we as in the ecosystem, has to be creative, right? Mm-hmm. So and it's not necessarily knocking on individuals' doors, but it could be more of conducting focus groups, and really I believe in council or advisory groups that you're inviting the community to participate in, so that you can get their perspectives. And also apply those learnings into the development of that research protocol where equity is embedded, right? So trust does take time, and so we must plan ahead in order to do that. And that may start with leaders of these organizations, these patient organizations or community health organizations, working with them and those trusted messengers within the community.
I'd like to call on Some wonderful hands have been raised. Megan Douglas, may we have your thoughts, please?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, Yasmeen.
Hi,
Thank
Megan.
you for the presentation. This was really great and great to see you. As you know, this learning series is part of the Network for Community Engaged Primary Care Research that the National Center for Primary Care is working on. And I think this, the conversation about trust is obviously really important. Can you talk about some of the kind of resources that may be needed and how we should be using funding in different ways, and from the sponsor side, funding for building that trust is an important component. Maybe we don't want to think about having to pay partners as part of building trust, but compensation is really important. So I think from the perspective of how we've been business as usual, what are some of the changes around resources, funding, allocations, staffing? I know you mentioned CHWs, but we should be thinking about to advance equity.
Yeah, that's a good question, Megan. Thank you. A couple of things. Let me just kind of start with the compensation piece. There are, so I'll just speak from my personal experience. Earlier in my career, when I was a research coordinator, all of those studies that I worked on, participants were compensated. And that could be cash, it could be money order, not like a $25 gift card. Not that that's a bad thing, but time is very valuable because you can't get it back. And so I think when we think about compensation, I think sometimes the thought is, well, if we pay them, then we don't want them to think that this is all, we're just going to pay them and then, that's the incentive for the study. But that's why I mentioned time, because whether it's traveling a long way to a study, whether it's traveling to your doctor's office, whether it's trying to get childcare, regardless, at least a reimbursement for a person's travel. I think compensation is a big thing. I think one of the things I think about in terms of funders, I'll call out the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, one of my former employers, where PCORI really focuses on within your application for an award, you have to embed a patient or community engagement plan as a part of that application, right? And so therefore it's required in order for funding. I think that could be applied across the board, so that not only is there investment in that, but there's also earmarking within that application, for example, or within that budget, to ensure that there is enough funding to cover whether you're going into a community, whether you're holding a focus group. I always say this, when we're bringing people together, never underestimate the power of food. Now, of course, you have to know everyone's dietary restrictions and all of that, but I say food as a mechanism to building community and bringing people together. So let's say, for an example, a research team is building trust or going into a community or meeting with, let's say, a neighborhood association, for example, and really talking about, let's say this community hypothetically has a particular disease condition that's very common in that community, for example. So ensuring that there is funding to, have those meetings, provide food as a meal, for example, for people, and really kind of establishing that camaraderie. That's just an example of that. And I think camaraderie is important as a part of that, building those relationships. And I believe across different types of funding models as appropriate, that should be a mechanism that's allowed to be earmarked as a part of that research plan and that budget. Did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that was really helpful. I love the PCORI model and agree that could be expanded in so many different ways, and definitely breaking bread. The only other thing I was going to add, as far as like the compensating of the community organizations that have the trusted relationship with communities, and I think that's a part of the funding formula that has been overlooked or really trying to make sure that those organizations that have put in the time, effort, and relationship building, if they're partners in studies, they have, those relationships built to recruit participants, but making sure that their time, effort, and relationship building is compensated as well. So.
Yeah, and that just sort of goes back to what I was saying about including that as a requirement for research grant or application, and having that be across a lot of different types of funding streams as appropriate, because that stakeholder engagement and or convening support is really needed. And calling out PCORI again, they actually fund projects that are specifically for funding or supporting stakeholder convening. So, and again, I think there's new grant models that need to be developed for specifically for that convening support across different funding announcements. So we really need to sort of tease it out a bit more thoroughly than we have in the past. And I think that would be a great start to maintaining and sustaining this effort for the long term.
A wonderful conversation. We have two more individuals who'd love to share something. I know, thank you so much, Selena Gore, for keeping your hand up. We really appreciate it. And in the chat, Emilio stated, understanding that relationships take time to build, what are some ways in which industry sponsors can start building relationships and trust with communities of color they haven't interacted with in the past?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways. And hi, Emilio. Good to see you. I think, a number of ways, and I sort of highlighted those in addressing the previous question. But when we think about industry sponsors, typically, I would say let me put it this way. There are many industry sponsors who are now really focusing on this in a meaningful way, right? And that includes the role of community engagement and expertise. And so, and there can be those who maybe have distrust in, biopharma or that kind of thing. So I think, and typically the industry has the resources to really support these kinds of efforts, right? So building relationships and trust with communities of color that they haven't interacted with the past. Who is the trusted messenger that's a part of that community? What's the organization or patient group that might represent that community? And really starting from there and contacting them and having them understand the purposes of the research you're conducting, why, how it can be applied, and to you as an individual, to improving health outcomes, and as well as a nation. And I think that needs to be communicated from the beginning across different types of sponsors, so that people know what they're getting into and what they're doing. I think that the pandemic really sort of turned many people into public health experts. So prior to the pandemic, my background is heavily in public health, but oftentimes people may say, well, what does that mean? So you think about your health departments and you think about a number of things. But after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, there were research terms and all kinds of things that were talked about nationally that normally would be more talked about in the medical and biomedical research industry. So I think really building, connecting those dots for those who don't really understand what is a clinical trial, that there have been measures of policy and mandates that you do whatever you want to human beings and human subjects, and a lot of the horrors that have historically taken place. The reason why we have policies now to protect human subjects is because of that. So I think really communicating what has improved, I think is an important way to communicate with communities, and really getting them to understand why and how this works, and not just sort of like, we want to collect your data and thank you, or here's one group, or and that can be surveying them. Again, that could be a town hall. It's hard, right? And I think we really need to roll up our sleeves and acknowledge that. And I believe that those who are in this field, as many of you are, that's why we do this, is to improve health outcomes. So we need to really think about this in a meaningful way and consider the human being as a part of that effort.
Oh, wonderful answer. Selena, thank you so much for your patience. Would you please let us know what your comment or question is?
Thank you so much. And Yasmeen, thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm Selena Gore with Women Heart. And I guess I have a comment and a question. The comment is that at Women Heart, we lean really into the causes for mistrust as opposed to focusing on the mistrust. I think when we do that, sometimes we're inadvertently putting the work at the feet of the people who don't trust, versus saying the problem is delayed diagnosis, misdiagnosis, increased mortality by virtue of the color of your skin. That's the issue, right? And so really focusing in on research questions on how to fix those issues versus framing the question as we've got a problem of mistrust here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that and we did that with PCORI, actually, right? We did a whole a convening and research series around the delayed and misdiagnosis of women with heart disease, right? So it's not, yes, it's an issue about communities of color. It's also a gender issue that we know very, very well. But I guess my question, Yasmeen, is there, can you think of a clinical trial that you would point to as sort of a gold standard, or a trial that got it right, or a trial that you would go, if only all trials look like that, we would be so much better off? Thanks.
Sure. The example that comes to mind, and again, I think the pandemic really not only highlighted an issue that's been taking place for decades, if not longer. The Moderna trial did pretty well in comparison to the other trials and enrolling diverse participation development of the vaccine. And that's really important because again, we have to test the safety and efficacy. And although we're all human beings in terms of, we have the same physical makeup, there's also other genetic or genomic points within us that, might have have a bad reaction or have an adverse event to that sort of treatment or vaccine, for example. And so really determining, and developing metrics that will collect data on ethnic and racial subgroups. So for example, and really aggregating and analyzing that data in a meaningful way. So for example, when we think about the category of Black, that is a huge diaspora of people around the world, okay? The category of Asian, that is a huge diaspora of people around the world. So how do we sort of, collect data on those subgroups so that we can really pinpoint those determinants that a particular group may improve on based on a certain therapeutic or outcome of that? I think that's something that needs to be considered quite a bit. And I think that's having that more accurate data, I think will inform a lot of these research efforts in a meaningful way. And thinking about, I think I've missed the second part of your question, Selena. Will you mind repeating it?
No, that was right. I just asked about your sort of, gold standard example, but and then my comment was just around focusing more on the causes of mistrust versus the mistrust itself.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I highlight that in one of our papers, the cause of mistrust, that we, again, mentioning some of the horrors that have taken place in research prior to there being a focus on making sure human subjects are protected. We have Henrietta Lacks, for example. I'm sure you all know who that is, but I don't think people understand, not this group, but what her cells have done for the advancement of medicine, for cancer drugs, for HIV drugs, for all kinds of drugs, from this one person cell who got obviously her cells were taken without her consent, but they have had an enormous contribution to science, right? Just that in itself is not, you don't want people taking your specimens and you don't know where they're going or what they're using them for. So the consent requirement, of course, is established now, but that's a more of a historical mistrust. But then I also want to highlight the disparities in distrust that are experienced today by people. So for example, if you're a person who maybe let's say you don't have health insurance, or even if you do have let's say you have access to high quality healthcare. I have access to high quality healthcare. But does that mean I don't experience disparities in healthcare system? Absolutely not. Does that mean that I don't experience inequities in healthcare system? Absolutely not. So I think we also need to, in addition to sharing how we've come to this point with those historical practices, also what takes place today at just a regular doctor's visit, right? And that can maintain that mistrust and really just treating people like human beings, putting the human being in this effort. I think sometimes that gets lost. So I would encourage researchers, and I believe it is the responsibility of the research team to communicate those elements to that community. One that shows honesty and compassion and building, and that does build trust automatically, but also highlighting that, what are the current experiences? Asking them, I always say, ask them, either ask them what they want or meet them where they are, right? So ask them, what are those, what happens to you when you go to the doctor's office on a regular basis? Are you denied care? Are you ignored? Are you, and so if you're feeling like that when you go to the doctor's office, you might not want to enroll in a clinical trial for fear that you're not going to be respected. So I think that's something that we have to acknowledge, and it has no bearing on socioeconomic status. And I see we're at time. Yes, Phoebe.
Subtle hint. Well, we want to thank you all for joining us today, and we'd like to call your attention to the evaluation for this presentation that's in our chat. Please, 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 please complete that for us so that we can continue to get better and better when we create this learning series to inform research and practice-based research on these important policy and actionable items that were discussed today. It's been dynamic. We thank you so very much for the passion and enthusiasm that you shared this information with. It was very engaging. We so appreciate it. Very practical. So we wish everyone a wonderful afternoon and a happy workday.
Bye, everyone.